Welcome back to Crime Scene 24/7. To our returning subscribers, thank you for always engaging. Your likes, comments, and shares keeps us motivated. And if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our chilling crime scenes. Here we dig deep, we investigate hard, and we bring you stories the mainstream left unsaid. So encourage us by engaging in our videos. Subscribe if you haven't, like, comment, and share. From the moment the door to the circuit courtroom in Spartanburg County, South Carolina, swung open on that September day, the air was heavy with more than just the chill of early fall. Inside, the sobs of a little girl, just 8 years old, were already echoing in the mind of every person present. Her name will remain protected, but the details of what she endured at the hands of her stepmother, Tenika Draper, are laid bare in court records and news reports. And today, we bring you the unflinching story of how one child's life was shattered while the system scrambled to respond. It began innocuously enough. Blended families, new guardians, moved-in stepmom trying to fit in with the children. But by the time investigators uncovered the full record, the trauma inflicted on this child was extensive, brutal, and almost incomprehensible. Draper, then 27, pleaded guilty on September 18, 2025, to 20 counts of unlawful neglect of a child and 2 counts of obstruction of justice, after prosecutors said she and others subjected the child to repeated physical, emotional, and psychological abuse. In the courtroom, the prosecution laid out a timeline of horrors. The victim locked in a closet, forced to stand for hours in a garbage can with trash thrown on her, made to eat animal feces, forced to wear a diaper and restricted from using the bathroom, repeatedly hit with a cutting board, force-fed laxatives, beaten while the bruises were disguised with makeup and temporary tattoos. The sentencing judge imposed a prison term of 35 years, followed by 5 years of probation. And yet, while this chapter closes for Draper, the investigation continues. Co-defendants remain under indictment, and more court dates are yet to come. In today's program, we guide you through the genesis of this case, how the abuse began, how the reporting and investigation unfolded. In April of that year, a report was made to the South Carolina Department of Social Services, SCDSS, after school personnel spotted the child wearing a soiled diaper, even though she was old enough to use a regular toilet. Investigators later learned that her stepmother, 27-year-old Tenika Draper of Wellford, South Carolina, had ordered the child not to use the bathroom for hours at a time. As the SCDSS looked deeper, they discovered the child had been repeatedly locked inside a closet, prevented from washing or cleaning appropriately, and made to stand inside a garbage can covered in trash for long periods. The reports indicate these punishments were alternated with other forms of abuse, including being forced to wear a diaper at night, being denied food unless bending to ingest animal feces, and being force-fed laxatives by Draper and associates. In the summer of 2024, medical personnel at the local hospital began documenting injuries, multiple contusions, abrasions hiding under temporary tattoos and makeup, and the fragile development of the young victim's body due to chronic neglect. Photographs and medical reports in the case file show the bruises-covered limbs and torso. Prosecutors later revealed the use of a large wooden cutting board and multiple beatings. By early September 2025, the investigation culminated with an arrest warrant for Tenika Draper. On September 18, 2025, Draper pleaded guilty to 20 counts of unlawful neglect of a child and 2 counts of obstruction of justice in the 7th Circuit Solicitor's Office jurisdiction. Assigned a circuit court date soon thereafter, The sentencing hearing took place on September 19, 2025, when the court imposed a prison term of 35 years, followed by 5 years of probation. The prosecutor warned in court that this sentence reflects not only the horror of the crimes, but also the need for the system to respond decisively when children are subjected to prolonged, multifaceted abuse by those entrusted with their care. Meanwhile, the case file remains open as additional proceedings continue against co-defendants. Shortly after the initial report to the South Carolina Department of Social Services, SCDSS, investigators from the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office in the 7th Circuit began coordinating with the 7th Circuit Solicitor's Office, gathering evidence in the home of 27-year-old Tenika Draper of Wellford, South Carolina. Investigators found photos, medical reports, and interviews that pointed to a pattern of sustained abuse of an 8-year-old stepdaughter. Among the documented acts, refusal to allow bathroom use, being forced to wear a diaper, spending hours confined in a garbage can strewn with trash, being locked in a closet, and forced ingestion of animal feces and laxatives. At one point, forensic findings showed bruises concealed by makeup and temporary tattoos. The investigation also traced involvement beyond Draper. Other adults living in or associated with the home were identified in earlier filings as co-defendants, including 28-year-old Ian Tatro, 47-year-old Trina R. Draper, and 28-year-old Ryan D. Zattel. These individuals were previously charged with counts of unlawful neglect, child torture, and obstruction. During search warrants and forensic exams, evidence emerged that the child had been isolated, deprived of basic hygiene and food, and subjected to both physical and psychological terror. The home was described by officials as a scene where no one believed a child could have survived much longer under those conditions. At the same time, school officials had flagged the child's unusual absences and bruising. A medical assessment placed the 8-year-old in hospital care because of findings consistent with extreme neglect and periodic physical trauma. The prosecution built the case around the unlawful neglect of a child statute, 20 counts against Draper, and 2 counts of obstruction of justice based on evidence that false statements and concealment took place during the investigation. In court, the prosecution stressed that the responsibility of care was legally hers. Draper had assumed a parental role, and that the abuse was systematic, not isolated. The judge, weighing the extensive record, accepted the plea on September 18, 2025, and on September 19, 2025, imposed the sentence of 35 years in prison, plus 5 years probation. What emerges is a tapestry of institutional failure, individual betrayal, and a child whose trust was wholly violated. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when the details inside the home on Wasp Nest Road in Wellford, South Carolina began to unfold. It was September 2, 2022 when deputies responded alongside the South Carolina Department of Social Services, SCDSS, to investigate what the agency described as a detailed child abuse allegation. Despite prior visits, a caseworker arrived at the residence to find that the 8-year-old girl, the primary victim, had been hidden by the adults in the home. Among the 4 children found there, the injured girl stood out. She walked with a noticeable limp and bore visible bruises on both legs obscured by temporary tattoos and makeup. The adults arrested included Ian Tatro, age 25, the victim's father; Tenika Draper, age 24 at time of arrest, the victim's stepmother; Trina Ray Draper, age 47, the victim's step-grandmother; Ryan Dezotel, age 28, the victim's step-uncle. During the bond hearing on October 7, 2022, the solicitor's office laid bare the nature of the abuse. Tatro reportedly gave the girl gummy laxatives disguised as candy. The girl thought she was eating candy. Instead, she was being forced to ingest substances that caused her body to betray her trust. The courtroom also heard of punishments so barbaric the prosecutors said the child met the criteria for a medical diagnosis of child torture. She had been made to eat cat feces and cat food. She had scars on her knees from kneeling in a crate. She was beaten with boards, cords, frying pans. As the case advanced, the 8-year-old was placed in foster care, while the other 3 children in the home were placed in DSS custody. In that critical moment, investigators realized this was not isolated abuse. It was systematic. What began as an anonymous tip to DSS transformed into one of the most disturbing cases in the upstate region's recent memory. The moment the law enforcement agents stepped into the house on Wasp Nest Road that September evening, they entered what one investigator later told colleagues was a scene no child could have continued to live in without being destroyed. The little 8-year-old girl, whose name remains sealed in court documents, sat stunned, bruised, and shaking, backed by medical evidence that confirmed the degree of her trauma met the threshold for a formal diagnosis of child torture. During hours of interviewing the child in a hospital room, detectives learned that her stepmother, 27-year-old Tenika Draper, had covered her injuries with makeup and temporary tattoos when outside scrutiny began sharpening. The girl described countless nights locked in a closet, mornings beginning with terror rather than safety, and punishment after punishment administered by people she was supposed to trust. Investigators found logs of neglect so extensive they could finally piece together the web of suffering. Diapers used to humiliate rather than protect, denial of bathroom access, and the horrifying reality of being forced to ingest animal feces. One forensic expert brought in by the prosecution later testified that the pattern of injuries, repetitive, escalating, hidden, was unlike typical neglect or single-instance abuse. It was systematic, intentional, and designed to break the child's will. The doctor's words were used in the courtroom to define what the law in South Carolina describes as torture of a child, not merely harm or neglect, but torture. At the same time, the forensic team processed photographs of swollen limbs and hematomas beneath concealing makeup. Forensic technicians gathered seized items in the home: old diapers, a wooden cutting board used as a blunt instrument, soiled garments, and cleaning supplies that had been used to mask the stench of waste. These physical evidences, together with the child's own disclosures, provided the prosecution with the foundation they needed to charge Draper and her co-defendants. Also notable was the role of the child's school and healthcare providers. She arrived at medical facilities repeatedly with unexplained bruises and injuries, while school staff noted her awkward gait and the way she hesitated to use the restroom. These signs, which might have triggered earlier intervention, were in fact fragmented until the anonymous tip reached the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office and the South Carolina Department of Social Services on September 2, 2022. Once the multi-agency team mobilized, they executed a search warrant at the home and began securing witness statements, digital records, and forensic photographs. One detective later recalled pulling into the driveway and seeing the children playing innocently in the yard. Inside, a nightmare had been unfolding. The juxtaposition struck him deeply, haunting his memory of the case. By the time the case moved toward plea hearings, much of the evidentiary work had already been done. Phone records showed calls made to conceal activities, lab reports confirmed ingestion of foreign materials, and social services logs depicted previous interventions where the home had been visited but the child remained in peril. In the courtroom, the sorrow in the girl's voice when she finally spoke was unmistakable. She said simply, "I just wanted someone to know." When the plea agreement was accepted on September 18, 2025, the prosecution remarked that the years of methodical investigation, careful forensics, and child advocate interviews had finally given voice to a young girl who had been silenced for far too long. The courtroom stood silent as the 8-year-old girl delivered her statement. Her voice, small yet unwavering, carried a weight no child should ever know. She detailed a life steeped in fear, how each morning she braced for pain instead of comfort, how every bruise became a mark of survival rather than a sign of childhood. Even now, in that room filled with spectators, the tremor in her voice underscored the magnitude of her ordeal. When the judge asked if she wished to address the defendants, she paused, looked toward the box, and simply said, "I just wanted someone to know." Those words echoed in a hush that seemed to reach every corner of the courtroom, leaving many in tears. The room held its breath as her words hung in the air, each syllable a tribute to the resilience she had summoned. As the plea agreement was read aloud, the deputies, medical witnesses, and Child Advocacy Center staff listened to the litany of bruises and head injuries that the 8-year-old bore. One forensic examiner testified how the pattern of injury met the threshold of child torture. The defense offered no objection When the sentencing date arrived, emotion filled the gallery. Family members of the victim, now placed in state protective custody, wore solemn faces. The defendant, Draper, entered the courtroom, her expression a mix of resignation and regret. The solicitor's office reminded the court of the child's journey, from hidden bruises and cat feces, forced ingestion, to the moment deputies arrived on September 2, 2022 at the home on Wasp Nest Road in Wellford. The evidence files, stacked on the prosecutor's table, bore the weight of months of investigation. And then, the sentence was pronounced. For Draper, the imposition of decades of imprisonment represented society's response to the innocence that had been so grievously stolen. Tears filled the eyes of those present as the victim's grandmother, quietly sobbing, held onto a folder of drawings the girl made in foster care. Simple sketches of sunshine and rainbows, a stark contrast to the darkness she had endured. After the gavel fell, the child's youngest siblings, still too young to fully grasp the meaning of the day, were led quietly out of the gallery. The investigators remained behind to sign off on remaining warrants. The work of coordinating protective services, closing out files, and preparing for upcoming trials continued unabated. While Draper's plea brought a measure of closure, the courtroom acknowledged that the healing for this fearless little girl had only just begun. The judge reminded everyone that the child would need not only justice, but long-term support. In the hallway outside the courtroom, onlookers whispered of the bravery of a little girl who simply wanted to be heard, whose truth unraveled a nightmare that will reverberate through the legal system in South Carolina for years to come. And yet, even as the bustle of the courtroom calmed, the echoes of the little girl's voice lingered. Outside the glass doors, social workers shared quiet glances, each aware that the events unfolding in that room marked only the beginning of a much larger healing journey. The child, now removed from the environment of harm, entered a protective setting where professionals began to unravel the layers of trauma she had endured, months and perhaps years of maltreatment, where fear replaced bedtime stories and survival supplanted hope. As the legal system closed one chapter with the plea of Tenika Draper, the broader inquiry remained far from over. Investigators and prosecutors signaled that additional defendants still face charges, and the process of tracing every act of neglect, every hidden bruise, every abusive act will extend into the future. Court calendars show forthcoming hearings against co-defendants whose involvement mirrored Draper's, or in some cases even surpassed her role in secrecy and cruelty. Every hearing transcript, every affidavit, every piece of forensic evidence contributes to the architecture of accountability. Behind the scenes, the director of the Child Advocacy Program in Spartanburg offered a rare interview, not for public broadcast, but for internal training. He spoke of the difficulty of distinguishing persistent neglect from child torture, of bending the legal definitions of harm so a vulnerable 8-year-old could be protected before permanent damage set in. The files show that months before the arrest, multiple red flags appeared: severe bruising across limbs, repeated trips to the hospital with ambiguous explanations, excuses about play injuries, while the true cause remained hidden. Each missed call, each unanswered question, accumulated into the horrifying mosaic that investigators would later describe in court. In the wake of sentencing, the child's voice took on a new role, no longer simply a witness to pain, but a catalyst for change. State legislators in South Carolina referenced the case during hearings on child welfare reform, using it to illustrate how agencies must coordinate better, how schools and medical centers must flag signs earlier, and how homes must be monitored when a child is in the care of multiple adults tied to criminal histories. The prosecutor's office cited the Draper case as evidence that unlawful neglect statutes alone may not always capture the full scope of what happened. But the law caught up this time, long after the suffering had begun. In the quiet of her foster placement, the girl drew pictures: a bright sun, a field of wildflowers, a home with a swinging porch, simple images that carried more meaning than any court document. Therapists working with her kept a small binder of those drawings, a reminder of the resilience still alive. The child may never fully reclaim the childhood she lost, but each new day brought a small step forward, a slow laugh, a whispered thank you, a permission to sleep without dread. And so the courtroom doors closed and the world moved on. But for that one 8-year-old girl, the journey ahead was long, layered, and deeply emotional. The legal victory was important, but not the end. The real test now is the healing, the rebuilding of trust, the transformation from victim to survivor. The aftermath of the sentencing of Tenika Draper rippled beyond the courtroom. Community leaders in Spartanburg County declared that the case would serve as a catalyst for systemic change. School administrators pledged to retrain staff on early warning signs. Medical professionals promised closer coordination with child welfare agencies, and lawmakers referenced the case when debating reforms to the state's statutes on child neglect and torture. At the same time, the victim, still only 8 years old at the time of the crime, was placed in long-term therapeutic care. Every session, every drawing she made of sunny fields and safe houses became a testimony to both her enduring courage and the depth of what she had endured. While the sentence on September 19, 2025 officially entered into record, the real work of healing extended into the home, the school, the clinic, and the heart of a little girl who survived the unthinkable. If you are moved by this story and want to see justice continue for victims like this brave little girl, don't let her voice fade. Subscribe to Crime Scene 24/7, where we bring you the real stories, the real evidence, and the real pursuit of truth. Hit that subscribe button, tap the bell icon so you never miss an update, and share this video to spread awareness about child abuse and the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. Every view, every share, every comment helps keep the spotlight on those who can't always speak for themselves. This isn't just another crime story, it's a reminder that silence protects no one. You can help make sure the next cry for help is heard. Stay alert, stay aware. This is Crime Scene 24/7, where justice never sleeps.